I'd be curious in your race, how did DWS sort of like pull the track up, so to speak, like between not debating and like what were the sort of experiences that you encountered as a challenger in terms of the establishment avoiding and eroding the process?
Yeah, there were, it's like I see three major arms of it that we were dealing with. I mean, the first thing was obviously the party establishment and our local DEC, our Dem clubs. They just ghosted us. To this day, they're still pretending that this race never happened. They are they would do forums for every other county race, whether it was sheriff, state attorney, whatever. And they never even invited us. They never, because for the same reason that they won't demand that Nancy Pelosi do a debate, they're not going to put Debbie on the spot either. So we have the party establishment that ghosted us. Then we have local media. And local media is extremely beholden to Debbie Wasserman Schultz. So with very few exceptions, there were a couple of conservative radio shows that would have us on. But anything that would be deemed towards the Democratic or the neoliberal side of things, we were just completely ghosted. But the third component that we have found that was extremely challenging and we're still working to chip away at was the labor unions.
Oh, God.
And breaking through, and the endorsement process and all of that song and dance, but the unions and the union leadership are so beholden to the establishment that they are no longer truly representing labor. And I'm very clear that I always stand with labor, always.
Yep.
But I do not always stand with unions because unions are not always acting in the best interest of their rank and file. So our AFL-CIO is very tight with Debbie, the head of our local. And he didn't even give me a screening, which apparently is a violation of their own bylaws. But they just did not. We would have meetings with individual unions and they would all say the same thing. We really like you. We'd love to get behind you, but this person. And
the same experience. Yeah.
So so I look at it as like party, media, unions. And those, to me, it's like the trifecta of being blacked out in a district. Like that was my experience. You're having that as well, I see.
Yeah, we call it a whiteout because
Okay.
it seems to be much more, that's the more accurate dynamic here. But yeah, I so appreciate the way you delineated that because in some respects, because specifically when you talked about how there's the party apparatus and that's local and national, there's the local media apparatus, which is very beholden to the incumbent. And I think one of the things that you and I both found opportunities in was the independent, often not local press to shine a light on campaigns and issues that the local press refused to cover. And, that's an interesting sort of like suggestion of the opportunity, that remains as these different forces are coming around. And in labor, I had certainly long acknowledged here as unfortunately part of the problem. And I stand like you in solidarity with labor.
Yeah.
And the question is, does labor stand in solidarity with itself? And this is really disappointing, right? Because I would love to say, march behind labor, except labor is marching behind corporate Democrats.
Yes.
And I'm not going to march in that direction. That's why we got here. And the inability of labor to demonstrate independence is, I'm not trying to cast blame here, but like we have a lot of structural issues that have led us into this corner. And one of them is that for at least 20 years, 30 years, if not longer, organized labor has taken its cues from institutional power holders instead of the rank and file. If organized labor was taking cues from the rank and file, Bernie Sanders would have been the president in 2016. We'd have had Medicare for all a long time ago. Organized labor is the key. And it's not just that it is eroded, and that's empirically, objectively true. Yeah. It has eroded and unfortunately lost its independence. And I think those things are connected because one of the reasons that labor has eroded is because Democrats have abandoned it. The NLRB has just been off the rails for decades.
We don't have a labor party. We don't have a labor party in this country, period.
That's right.
And this is the massive problem. I find people, I'm sure, ask you about third parties all the time. I mean, that's one of the common questions is, what are your thoughts on third parties? And I'm, of course, supportive of any of that. But the reality is I'd be happy if we actually had two parties. We need a labor party. You cannot have capitalism without a party representing labor. And right now we have two corporate parties. So when you don't have a labor party, so we don't even have two functioning parties like that are actually have independent platforms and agendas.
We have one party with two brands.
Yeah, we have one party in two colors, and one party is a little bit more politically correct and says nice things about LGBTQIA, and the other party sends out mean tweets. So that's what we're dealing with. But
Yep.
the labor component is massive. And I know it's not as bad there, but in Florida, we're a right to work state. So
Oh, right.
labor is incredibly weak here to begin with, and which to me makes it riper for labor leadership to sort of like suckle up at the teat of corporate America and just sort of blame it on, oh, well, we're a right to work state. We don't have a lot of power here. And yet they can just continue to just go on and on and on. And they're just begging for scraps.
I want to tell one quick story here around the Protecting Right to Organize Act, which addressed, it was a bill that passed the House with Nancy Pelosi's eventual support this spring after she had opposed it from the point of its introduction. And I do want to give some credit where it's due here. Many labor leaders did step out this spring and invite her to support this groundbreaking transformative bill that, among other things, if it were ever passed by the Senate, would end right to work laws in the states by precluding them and requiring opportunities for organized labor participation. The point I want to make here is that when Pelosi abandoned her long opposition to the Protecting Right to Organize Act, she, as she has on half a dozen other issues over the course of the last year, she basically adopted positions that our campaign had taken first. And I see that as an indication of the value that campaigns like ours present in a democracy in terms of holding the incumbents accountable, basically forcing them to show up for work. I am the first Democrat in 30 years to ever reach a general election against Nancy Pelosi. And it is striking to me that in the last year, she's shown up far, far to her own historical left. The place where this has probably become most poignant also proves my point, and that's the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, separate issue, a few months after the Protecting Right to Organize Act passed the House. The Justice and Policing Act passes the House in response to a movement across the country defending Black lives. And the point I want to make here is that there were a bunch of components in the Justice and Policing Act, many. It was a wide-ranging bill. Nancy Pelosi had never supported any of them. Many of them I'd fought for a decade. The bill that they ultimately passed not only included many things I've long clamored that she has opposed, and I'm grateful for her finally figuring it out. Unfortunately, the bill expanded police budgets and surveillance, which is not what we were asking for in the streets. And just to compound the sort of salt in the wound here, while we were all in the streets saying their names, chanting justice for George Floyd, justice for Breonna Taylor, Nancy Pelosi takes the podium at the press conference introducing the bill and gets his name wrong, confusing him with a comedian from 50 years ago. And, you know, it's so on brand.
She had me at the kente cloth. You know what I'm saying? Like,
yeah.
That to me, like, was so symbolic of where we are and what people think is a solution on. And
Right.
that's also across the board with Democrats. They're much more involved and interested in symbolic gestures, taking down Confederate monuments. Here we have a local commissioner that is, her focus is changing the name of our local Dixie Highway because Dixie Highway is, that somehow is racist. And what's interesting—
I'm down with changing names and taking down statues, but we can't pretend that that's it. Right.
That's the problem, is those are all very nice gestures. But when you do that, but then you turn around and you increase the police budget, the people in our vulnerable communities, they're not that concerned with the name of Dixie Highway. I've asked them actually, and they're just not. What they're concerned about is jobs and eating.